Intentionally bringing a soul into existence is a selfish desire. When people choose to have a child, they are willing to gamble on the well-being of that potential being for their own benefit. The potential being, who does not exist prior to birth, cannot give consent to being born, but is still forced into a world of endless suffering due to the selfish desires of others. Parents often willfully ignore uncertain factors that can amplify that child's suffering, such as genetic diseases, mental illnesses, physical disabilities, socioeconomic disadvantages, discrimination, and other unforeseen events that the potential being cannot consent to. From the very beginning of life, one is subjected to a life of suffering, which one does not even have to observe by looking at the evolving complexity of life. Just from what could be considered a fundamental rule of human life, a living being cannot even stay still on their own accord without needing to consume energy, or they will suffer. And now that this child is subjected to this lifelong cycle of suffering but is programmed to continue it, that child is now a slave to the will. After the intentional act of having a child, which many who partake in this act can avoid, that child will suffer regardless of the parent's intervention, just by being brought into this world of suffering to aid the parent's sense of self-preservation, pushed by the will that is embodied into life. But ultimately, this painful cycle of life that children are programmed to walk endlessly on by the will is only met by the inevitable, which is considered another fundamental rule of human life: death. Life is inherently a raw deal, and it is important to recognize that what we perceive as practical or superficial happiness is merely a probability, whereas suffering is guaranteed. When one intentionally has a child, that child will never have absolute happiness, as to have absolute happiness is to be in a state of peace and completeness free from disturbances and desires, which is unattainable. New life is born out of desire, and one will continue to live on throughout life with desire until death. Since absolute happiness is unattainable, and suffering is an automatic state of life, like a chronic disease, seeking pleasure as a remedy can always be outside our control. There is no true end state to strive for, except for the self-imposed illusions of this state we create to give us something to do and cope with existence while continuing on this wheel of suffering driven by the will. To try to cope with the unsettling realization that there is no justifiable reason to continue running because we became too self-aware, but the will compels us to do so. We as more self-aware species try to make up our own code and beliefs for ourselves to follow, even blindly, to try and reduce our suffering and cope with existence, which can be okay if it does not inflict unnecessary suffering on others. It can also be used as a way to honor our souls, and even though this can be considered futile or an illusion, it might be one of the few potential frameworks that one can have to have limited freedom against the will that we are programmed with. Striving to not let our programming burden another soul into this world of suffering, that the will try to deceive us into thinking we don't live in a place that embodies hell, is a way to deny our programming with the least amount of pointless suffering as we live out our lives together, as self-aware minds choosing to break away from playing the game. Everywhere you look, our self-aware souls are intertwined with the will as we try to cope with the suffering and uncertain reality of existence, like in many religions that have become corrupted by the will, with dogmatic hubris to live a life striving away from the pursuit of the unattainable truth, and to continue hubristic self-preservation at the expense of others' suffering by offering them divine purpose, order, and award with no actual evidence of them being true. And yet, for many who must use religion to bring them peace of mind, purpose, and order, at the end, we do not know what happens after. And though we can try to run away by lying to ourselves to help cope with this uncertainty, which to some degree is okay, in the end, death awaits. Honoring one's soul, even if it seems pointless, is admirable only if one does not inflict unnecessary suffering on others, like bringing potential beings into existence. Past the delusion that willful parents believe they are selflessly bringing life into existence and ignorantly believing they are giving them a chance for true happiness that they will never have when there is desire, you'll always find some form of selfishness that stems from their own desire to justify pulling a soul from non-existence and burdening it with life. These selfish desires are only there to help self-preserve themselves, but many cannot see this because they are blinded by the will. It is wrong to bear children out of need, wrong to use a child to alleviate loneliness, wrong to provide purpose in life by reproducing another copy of oneself. It is wrong also to seek immortality by spewing one's germ into the future as though sperm contains your consciousness. Irvin D. Yalom. When self-desire outweighs the well-being of a potential soul, That is selfishness in its purest form. That soul that will then inevitably suffer will also be a slave that will need to carry on the will that we are programmed with, and will try to attack whatever takes that away. To act like a hive mind, controlled by the will, under the illusion that they have complete free will. It is the will that gives us our biological instinct to survive like any other living organism. But it is what blinds us just enough to our excessive suffering to continue life with no actual justifiable reason, which self-awareness cannot cope with, so we attempt to make our own. And while other species blindly followed it, human beings became too self-aware. And it is at that point of time that, to rationalize our suffering, meaninglessness, and uncertainty that life shows us, we look to religion and stoop low by having children, succumbing to the will. In the end, as the will continued to blind us by deeming the burdening of another soul into existence is natural, so it's good, or it will become stronger for themselves just to endure more suffering until it inevitably can't, and still proclaim this is a good thing. But in actuality, none of it is. Maybe this whole time, as we surpass a new threshold of self-awareness, the joke about life was that the best way to win the game was to not play the game at all. And instead of feeling disillusioned by this realization, why don't we genuinely laugh at the joke and embrace it as we journey together through life hand in hand until the end? Let us strive to pointlessly honor our souls, as that is all we can do without burdening another potential soul with this cycle of suffering, or inflicting unnecessary pain on our fellow beings who share the same fate. Let our self-awareness give us the limited freedom we need to stand up against the will that enslaves us all and break away.